All right, everyone. I think we're right around that time. So, of course, as more people start joining the room, please sit down. And, of course, all of you who are standing in the back, we do have overflow rooms available should you need it. So welcome, everyone, to this talk. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being part of Build. I'm Christian Stockwell. I'm a program manager on Internet Explorer. And my team's responsible for building the high-performance layout engine that powers the CSS pipeline in Internet Explorer. And my team's also responsible for building some of the features we'll dive into in more detail over the next hour. But of course, this conference is all about you guys. As developers, this is really about how you're going to build the touch-friendly, the immersive, the clean and crisp Metro-style apps that your customers are going to expect on Windows 8. And in particular, this talk is about how you're going to use some of the core capabilities and patterns in CSS3 to build those Metro-style apps. So I'm really excited to be with you today to share some of those core capabilities and patterns. And we have a lot of material to cover over the next hour, so I'm going to dive right in. The structure of this talk, I'm going to start by reviewing some core CSS concepts. These are concepts that exist in CSS2, 2.1, and CSS3, so they're not new. And then we're going to use that as a foundation to build up some of the improvements that CSS3 is introducing that allows you to build great Metro-style apps on top of Windows 8 and Internet Explorer 10. After setting that foundation, we're going to spend the bulk of this talk talking about three core areas where CSS3 provides you with new capabilities and tools to create great Metro-style apps. In particular, we'll talk about how CSS3 provides you with some core capabilities in CSS3 flexible box layout and CSS3 grid to structure your app. Once we've structured your app, we're going to talk about how you can use CSS3 regions to flow content within that structure that you've provided your app. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to take that structured and flowed content, make it beautiful with CSS3 multi-column, CSS3 hyphenation, and position flows. And of course, as you leave here today, I'm hoping that you'll have a really good appreciation for how to create clean and flexible Metro-style apps with CSS, and of course, how to create beautiful text-centric layouts with CSS3. But most of all, what I want the takeaway from this talk to be is that CSS3 and HTML5 enable you to build beautiful Metro-style apps. You've seen this slide in particular several times now, but it's required. So here's where we are today. We're really covering the core CSS, JavaScript, and HTML engine that covers both desktop apps and Internet Explorer 10, as well as Metro-style apps building on top of the Windows 8 web platform. One thing that's really cool about this talk and some of the other talks, for example, Ted Johnson's talk earlier today, is that all of the features we're going to look at work identically in Internet Explorer 10, as well as Metro-style apps using HTML. Now, before we dive into some of these core CSS constructs, I'm going to switch over very quickly to a demo app that we created in it doesn't look like anything until I bring my computer back from sleep. It doesn't look like very much. It probably pales in comparison to some of the amazing Metro-style apps that you're going to build on top of the Windows 8 web platform. But what it does do is it exemplifies some of the patterns, some of the characteristics of Metro-style apps that you've heard several people talk about at this point. So you've heard Sam Moreau talk about the principles driving Metro-style designs. Here you have a sample magazine app. You can see that it's really focused on the content, not on the Chrome. You can see that the content of this app is arranged along clean lines. As I snap this app, you'll see that the content rearranges itself to be a great touch-first experience, both in a snap view or when it's full screen. There's no scroll bars here. There's a few characteristics here. And then what we'll see is, of course, let's bring that back full. You'll see that not only is it focused on the content, not only is there great typography, but this type of app integrates very well with different types of media, in particular, in this case, an image that flows really well with the content of the magazine. So setting the stage, let's take a look at how all of that is possible. Let's go back to the PowerPoint for a second. So we've set a stage, we've looked at one magazine app, again, pales in comparison to some of the amazing apps all of you are going to build on top of the web platform, but it does exemplify a few characteristics of Metro-style apps, namely that it's clean and crisp, that it has a great touch-friendly experience on multiple different resolutions and sizes, and that integrates media very well with the text-centric design. So as we dive into core CSS concept, I want to get a feel for how many of you in the audience are primarily JavaScript, HTML, or CSS web design developers. So just by show of hands. Okay, so pretty good, about half of you. And how many of you have ever created a site or an app using those web technologies? Okay, so pretty much everyone in the audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here reinforcing some of the concepts that you're already probably aware of, having designed apps and sites with CSS. Of course, all of you know that there's a tremendous surface area in the CSS standard, so I'm just going to focus in on a few core concepts that you're going to use when you go build your great Metro-style apps. Of course, you're going to start by separating content from presentation. All of you know this by now as CSS developers. And what that allows you to do is create your content with HTML and then style your content with CSS. That's always been very important when creating sites and apps in the web platform, and in particular is more important as you develop Metro-style apps that are going to adapt well to multiple screen resolutions and provide a great user experience across those resolutions. Beyond separating your content from your presentation, there's going to be three core concepts in CSS that you want to be aware of. In particular, that CSS is a box-oriented layout model. So for example, when you lay out content in CSS, if you have a div, for example, that div will lay out vertically below the preceding div. If you have something like a span, that span will lay out to the right of the previous spans. So there's really two types of flows in CSS, inline or block. And of course, CSS provides you with a bunch of capabilities to switch between an inline flow and a block flow. Beyond those simple flows, CSS also provides you with a set of capabilities to manipulate individual elements and take them out of the flow or manipulate how they behave within that flow. So you can use properties like CSS float to instruct an element that should be positioned to the left or the right of its container and have the text flow around it. Alternatively, you can use CSS absolute positioning to take an element out of the flow and position it at a very specific X and Y coordinate. Again, as web developers, you know this is pretty much your bread and butter. One thing I want to call out here, if you look at these flow and positioning properties, is that they're really focused on individual elements. What that means is as a website designer, as a web app developer, heretofore, what you would have to do is design your site based on these building blocks. You'd have to start from the bottom up and build your app up out of these constituent parts. What CSS lacked up until now is a great mechanism to design your site or your app from the top down and then position content within it. We'll see how that changes with CSS3. Now, of course, CSS also has this really cool concept of overflow. This is the idea that in some cases you may have more content than you have available space. And CSS provides you with a few mechanisms as developers to reconcile that disparity. For example, you can add scroll bars, and you'll see this on the web today everywhere. As you have sites that are larger than the physical monitor, you'll add a scroll bar to the right so you can scroll to all of that content. Alternatively, CSS provides you with capabilities to simply clip your content and make it inaccessible, or have it overflow its container. Of course, none of these three experiences are really great for touch, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as we get into this presentation. Now, what's really cool about CSS3 is that it's looked at all of those three core concepts and has augmented it. So for example, instead of being element-based, CSS3 provides us with great capabilities to be app-based. We can take a top-level design to our apps and build our apps from the top down. CSS3 also provides us with great mechanisms to improve how overflow is handled in the web platform. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. And of course, CSS3 provides us with great mechanisms to improve the quality of text layouts across all of those constituent parts. So one of the important evolutions that's happened in the web is that it's moved from being site-based to being app-based. And similarly, CSS3 has evolved to be very much focused on apps, and it's a great technology for building apps. Let's start by looking at how you can structure your Metro-style app using a couple of core constructs, CSS3 grid, which you've probably heard about a lot up till now, and CSS3 flexible box layout. Again, one of the things that distinguishes these two constructs from previous constructs that you may be aware of having worked with CSS for a while is that really focus on building top-level apps and designing your app from the top down. So we're going to switch over again to another demo. For those of you who are familiar with previous releases of Internet Explorer, who have attended Ted Johnson's earlier talk today, this should be a familiar site to you. This is the Internet Explorer test drive site. So this site is something that we release every version of Internet Explorer, and we release again with Windows 8 Developer Preview. And all it does is collect together some of the demos that you can use to explore some of the new capabilities in the platform. Again, this site is live, so as you leave this room here today, you can start playing with all of these new demos on your Windows 8 machine. So let's go to the flexible box layout demo. And what's really cool about flexible box layout is that it provides you with really simple mechanisms to create a very wide range of layouts for your app. And now, again, by show of hands, a bunch of you have said that you've worked with CSS before. How many of you have ever tried to center content vertically within an element? So that was good. There's a bunch of people raised their hands, and a few people chuckled kind of despairingly with wry smiles on their face. And historically, creating something like vertically centered content in CSS is tremendously difficult to do. What's really cool about CSS3 is it makes it very, very simple and completely declarative. So for example, here on this particular demo, what you can see is on the top left of this page, I have a sample region where you can see Flexbox in action. On the top right, I have a set of sliders that allow us to manipulate the CSS properties applied to that flexible box. And on the bottom right, I have a markup view that allows you to view the markup that I use to style the content on the left. As you see, of course, I can center content. That's what you're seeing today. But I can also align that content to the top, to the bottom, center it. I can stretch it. Or I can align it by the baseline of the text contained within the flexible box items. Really powerful mechanism to allow you to center content or treat it the way you want for your app. And with that, you can also, of course, manipulate the horizontal alignment of boxes. So if you want to center your content, you can do that. You can align it to the start, the end, the center, or you can even justify it across the available space in your flexible box container. Now, there's a lot of properties here. Of course, not only can you align things vertically or horizontally within your element, but you can also control the direction of that content. So here I can reverse the direction of my content from right to left to right. Or I can change the box orientation of all of this content, simply swapping it from horizontal to vertical orientations. All of this is done through very, very simple CSS properties, no JavaScript required, no changes required to the markup of my page. Heretofore, getting these types of rich quality layouts was very difficult to do in the web platform, tremendously easy with the CSS3 Flexbox. Of course, beyond the properties that allow you to control the flexible box container, there's a set of properties that allow you to control items within the Flexbox. Now, they wouldn't be flexible if you didn't have some capability to tell these items to take up available space. So here you can have the flexible box flex property applied to elements in the Flexbox and ask that particular box to take up whatever space is available. Where that's really cool for you is as developers creating Metro-style apps that are going to scale to multiple resolutions and screen sizes, is that now when we resize our app or get snapped or otherwise have a smaller resolution, that third box will adapt, shrinking or growing to the available space. That's really cool. Of course, I think one of the easiest ways to try to see these features in action is to look at a few samples where we think you may use Flexbox and the other features that we're going to go through today to see how they could be used in the wild. So here we have a few samples, and you'll see this is another one of those common patterns you'll see in many of the demos today, where you can create, for example, a very simple menu with items in a flexible box. Here I've created a vertical menu, and I've just used a few simple properties to tell the items in that menu to stretch. And of course, I can make this a horizontal menu just by swapping a single CSS property. Of course, I can create simple collections. Now, this is really powerful. I said that there's a bunch of different ways you could orient your content within a flexible box, order it from left to right or top to the bottom. And one of the ways you may use that is by creating collections of items that you just want a container for. So here, for example, I have 9 items, just sorted from 1 till 9. But of course, I can change that to be from the right to the left. I can make that a vertical versus horizontal orientation, and I could even make it orient from the bottom to the top instead of the top to the bottom. And of course, maybe those orientations aren't your cup of tea, and you want to have something more exotic. So let's go to the item properties. There's this magical box ordinal group property, which allows you to even create custom sortings for your element. So here in my demo, I'm going to add a box ordinal value. You'll see that a bunch of these elements contained within the Flexbox now have a box ordinal value of either 2 or 3, and Flexbox is sorting them in terms of their box ordinal value from smallest to largest. So you can easily do things like sort your elements by even numbers, by odd numbers, or even by prime numbers, just by manipulating those simple CSS properties. Very, very powerful, again, with no JavaScript required, which means you get great speed, and you don't have to change your markup or spend your time writing a lot of code. And of course, one of the ways you're going to be using Flexbox is to create very simple app layouts. Again, this is a great technology for creating simple layouts that expand and contract with the available space for your app. So here's one example of the type of app layout that you're going to create with flexible box layout. And all we have here are 2 columns of fixed size. So you can imagine maybe this is your an email reader, right, where you'd have a set of folders, you'd have the content within the folders, and then you'd have the content of a particular mail in that content region. And just by using CSS, I can grow or shrink that third region, and you'll see that the space is distributed amongst them. Of course, I can add a second box flex property, so maybe I want to have the second and third columns share that available space, and I could do that very easily, again, with a single CSS property. Of course, I can also share that space in a specific proportion. So by adding a box flex value of 2 to the second box and of 1 to the third box, I can share that space a 2-to-1 proportion between the 2 boxes. Again, very, very simple, all declarative, with no change to your markup or JavaScript. You can get really different effects for your app. Oh, sorry. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. For each of these demos, there's a lot of concepts. So I want to spend a couple of minutes after each demo just reiterating a few of the key concepts so you understand how we're going to proceed. Whoa. So with Flexible Box, one of the ways you're going to use it, of course, is start by defining how you're going to define the direction and ordering of all your elements. There's a bunch of different properties to do that, to either manipulate the left to right progression, the top to down progression, or the vertical or horizontal progression. You'll be using properties like box lines, box pack, and box flex to distribute space both within those elements and between them. And of course, you use box align to define whether you want to have a vertical or horizontal alignment. Now, one of the key points here is because Flexbox has this box align property, space is flexibly distributed either horizontally or vertically. So what that means is, as an app developer, where you're going to use Flexbox is when you want to create a very simple, light layout for your app, and you really want to partition the space either vertically or horizontally. So again, with maybe something like an email map, that's what you want. You want a simple layout, and you just want to be able to flex the size of the app horizontally to give that third content region a little more space. In other applications, that may not be what you want to do. So we'll see in a second how grid serves you well there. Flex is going to be perfect for you if you want to create very lightweight menus. You saw a couple of them there. In fact, lightweight collections or very simple designs. And in fact, if you look at my demo here, what I used Flexbox for as I built the demo is to create all those tabs at the top of the page and to make sure that I had space reserved for both the demo location and the controls. And I used Flexbox for that in the demo that we just played with. Now, of course, if Flex is designed for very simple apps, Grid is its big brother, really useful for creating more complex layouts. And to really to get a feel for this, I want to sort of ask another question to the audience. Now, how many of you have tried to create a liquid 3-column layout in CSS before? Yeah, some more laughs and a lot of hands raised. You know, historically, creating something like a 3-column layout has been tremendously difficult, again, with CSS 2.1. And what's really cool about grid is it makes that type of layout, in addition to many other types of layouts, very trivial to achieve. So again, let's swap over to the demo machine. And let's go to the second demo here. So we'll swap over to grid. And again, this follows the same similar pattern. On the left, you have a sample grid. On the right, you have some controls to manipulate the grid. And we'll see that the markup at the bottom, that's just a little off screen, shows you the live view of the markup. Now here, I've created a sample 4x4 grid. You'll see at the bottom left here that there's very little markup required. This is all the markup you need to create a 4x4 grid with CSS3 grid. You'll see that there's one property I use to define the grid, -ms-grid, which you also see as vendor prefix. This is a very, very new, very cool feature, but because it's an evolving standard, we have a vendor prefix to make sure you can use it with confidence and not run into future versions of the standard. Of course, to define 4 columns and 4 rows is very, very easy. All I have to do is use the grid columns property and the grid rows property and define my columns declaratively. Those of you who are experienced in CSS will also notice something funny here, this new FR unit. You've never seen that before. It's new to grid, and it's similar to how Flexbox had this box flex property that allowed you to define proportions between elements. Similarly, grid has the FR unit to define a fractional unit. So here I've defined 4 grid columns and 4 grid rows, and because they all have the same fractional unit, that space is divided equally across all of them. You'll see that if I instead make that first column a 2FR column, and possibly the first row as well, now all of a sudden the available space gives twice as much space to that first column and first row than to the remaining rows and columns. Now, where grid is really cool is now if you start to resize your grid, all of those proportions are maintained. And if we go back here, we can also make those 2 rows at that row and column a fixed size. So here, let's make them both 75 pixels wide and tall, and then we'll resize it again. You'll see that with no JavaScript, again, this is all declarative. You get to be able to maintain proportions between fixed size and fractional size columns and rows. Very, very simply, all declarative, literally with 4 values for 2 properties each. Really powerful stuff. Now, of course, creating a grid is a lot of fun, but if you can't actually create an app with it, if you can't insert content into the grid, it's not quite what you'd want. So, of course, grid allows you to do that. And let's add a couple of items to this grid. So here, we'll scroll down and just look at the markup for a second. All I've done here is added a new div to my markup. And again, with CSS, I've declared where it will be positioned, which cell, which row, and how many rows and cells it should span. Of course, if I want to create something maybe like a header for my app, I can easily do that by manipulating the column span property. Again, all declarative. We could add a second property, a second element. And maybe we want this to be the content of our app. Let's have it span a couple of rows. And of course, these elements, because they're placed in a column and a row, and because they're spanning columns and rows, as I resize my grid, they'll resize in turn. Now, of course, because this is all declarative, of course, you can start adding additional value on top of this. So if I have an app where, for example, after designing, after playing with it, I decide that I don't want a header, I want a footer. Well, of course, you can do that easily with CSS3. It's all declarative. So let's just grab that and drag it down. Again, no JavaScript required, absolutely no changes to your markup required. It's one property that you have to change in your CSS. So I promised that it was easy to create a 3-column layout in grid. So let's take a look at how you can do that. Again, here all I've done is I've created a very simple 3-column layout with a fixed header, a fixed footer, and some fixed sidebars. And of course, as I resize my grid, you'll see that middle content region is the only place where I'll use up the available space. Really powerful stuff. Again, this would be dozens, if not hundreds, of different properties in CSS 2.1, and really trivial to accomplish in CSS 3. Of course, you can create more interesting grids. Of course, some beautiful colors are available. And of course, you can create complex grids like you'll get out of the template if you're creating a grid project with Visual Studio for a Metro-style app. Of course, again, what's really cool here is you declare your markup, and if after the fact you want to come back and change your site, it's really easy to do without changing any markup. So here, for example, I've created an app. It's an app primarily oriented around 2 sets of 2 columns. And maybe after the fact, instead of having 2 sets of 2 columns, I want 1 set of 4 columns. Maybe difficult to do in CSS 2.1, very easy to do with grid. All I'm going to do is tweak that middle column, make it 1 fractional unit, and it's basically distribute amongst all the other elements of my page. And of course, I can take that complex layout and again make that header a footer with no change required in JavaScript or HTML. It's all done in CSS. Now, where this becomes very powerful for you as Metro-style app developers is that you can combine these core concepts of CSS Grid with concepts available in CSS media queries to adapt your page, adapt your app to multiple resolutions or to a snap view versus a full screen view, very, very easily with no change to your markup or JavaScript. That's CSS3 grid layout. Of course, let's reiterate a couple of points. So as you build your grid, you're really going to start by defining your grid. One of the best things about grid is that you can start by defining the top-level design for your site or app. And you'll do that by defining a set of grid rows and columns with -ms-grid columns and -ms-grid rows. You'll then want to place content within your grid, of course. And you could do that with a set of other grid properties. And one thing I didn't show in this particular demo is that you can actually align content within your grid. So if you notice in this demo, all of my elements were perfectly sized to fit within a column or row. In the real world, you'll have all sorts of content that may not fit perfectly within a column, but you can align it to your column lines. So for example, if you have an element, you can center it vertically within a row. You can align it to the top of the row, or you can align it to the bottom of a row. And similarly with columns, you can align content to the left, right, or center of a column. Really powerful, all declarative. So where you're going to want to use grid versus flexbox is if you want to create an app that partitions space both vertically and horizontally. This is going to be the case for probably most of you because you want to create a great app that fits well on various screen resolutions and different windowing modes in Windows 8. Again, because all the positioning and styling is independent of markup order, doesn't require JavaScript. You can combine it with features like CSS media queries to reorder and reposition content for those different modes. And of course, it's perfect for more complex Metro-style apps. And for most of you, I'd recommend that you start with the Visual Studio template, grid templates available to you in Windows 8. And we spend a little time talking about how to structure your app. You're going to start by looking at how you want to design your app from the top down, and then lay out your content according to that structure. The second thing you're going to want to do as you build a Metro-style app that has a great touch-first experience is figure out how you want to flow your content within that structure. The way you're going to do that is by using CSS3 regions. This is a really cool new feature, one of the newest features I'm going to talk about today. We'll go into it in a little bit of detail. And then I'll point you to some additional resources. Let's get back here. So to reinforce the value of CSS regions, let's look at the web as it exists today. So the web as it exists today is really that column of text to the left. You'll see that there's a lot more content that fits within the container. So the way the web works is that I'll have to scroll to see that rest of that content. I have to scroll up and down. As I do that as a user, what that means is that I'm losing my ability to track the content. Probably means I'm going to have to start reading over again. And I'm going to lose some time trying to catch up with that scroll. A fairly poor experience, but not disastrous. With touch, it becomes even more damaging because at that point, we're not scrolling with a mouse, we're scrolling with our finger, and you're very much predilected to lose your space as you're reading. Of course, that's a poor experience, but it doesn't necessarily look particularly bad. If you're creating a more complex app layout in the world as it existed before, you're going to have some other issues. So here's a site that I've created with a more complex app layout, and maybe in this particular case, I have a little less space than I accounted for because I'm in snapped mode. All of a sudden, I have a bunch of different scroll bars. If I'm a user using your app, this isn't exactly the experience that I want. It's a little poor. You can imagine that it would be right around here when I have to scroll in that fourth column to get a little text, I may get a little fed up and go look for a different app. Now, what's really cool about CSS3 regions is that now you have a capability to handle overflow much more gracefully. So let's look at how CSS3 regions work to give you a new mechanism to deal with overflow beyond having to scroll or clip your content. So here, all I've defined is an iframe that contains that same text content. So that's the same text content that right before was just a long scrolling region. I've defined a flow using the -ms-flow into property, and I've named that flow myFlow. Now what you'll see is I have two divs on my page. Each div takes part in that flow. It uses the flow from property to tell the browser that it wants to receive its content from that iframes flow. And I've used a little JavaScript and CSS to be able to swap between those two divs. So what you'll see is instead of scrolling, having to add a scroll bar and then scrolling down the content, instead of the overflow from one element is placed into that second element. And so I can use CSS and JavaScript to easily manipulate between the two of them. Now what that means as an app developer on Windows 8 is instead of having to create an app that when snapped simply adds a scroll bar, instead you can use CSS regions to create text flows that you can pan through to create great text reading experiences on the various form factors that you're going to be supporting. And of course, it also lends itself to creating great-looking, more complex apps. So if I've created a Metro-style app with a more complex design, and I want to have a text flow that looks something like this, maybe with some images, maybe with an ad or two, this is how I build it. And of course, even on smaller form factors, I could flow all of that content into another set of divs that all just participate in the same flow. And it's really powerful stuff. Here I've used a little JavaScript to create the pagination mechanism, but none of that's inherently required to use CSS regions. Again, to do this in the world before, you'd have to write a ton of JavaScript, a lot of HTML markup. You'd run into a lot of performance problems. In the world of CSS3, you can do that with a single property. Now, this is a very simple example, almost trivially so. All I've done is defined a flow with an iframe content using the flow into property. I've defined a target for that flow using the flow from property. What's really cool about regions is they actually define a fairly rich API surface on top of those simple concepts. I haven't gone into a lot of detail in this demo. You can read more online. It defines a property, an event, and a method. And one of the ways you can use that API surface is, for example, to create an app that adapts well for multiple screen sizes. So, for example, I showed an example where if you remember, that 10th div only was half filled with content. You can imagine that if I opened up that same app on a 27-inch monitor or a 32-inch monitor, maybe half of those divs would actually not have any content because they filled up, the text was sufficiently small that it only filled up some of the first elements. What I can do is then I could use MS region overflow to loop through all of those elements, test whether they have overflow, and maybe hide the elements that don't. Similarly, you can use MS region update and get region content to manipulate your regions dynamically. Really powerful stuff. There's a lot of detail here. I suggest you play with the demo and then work with the APIs, but there's a lot of power there. Okay. Now again, one of the ways you're going to create, to use CSS regions to create rich text layouts for your app and flow content across multiple disjoint containers. You're going to be using it to create elegant and adaptable text layouts that provide users with a great text-first experience across a broad range of resolutions and form factors and windowing size for your apps. Of course, it's ideal for creating complex text-centric apps such as a magazine or a book, but you can imagine you could use it in a game or any other app where you want to have a text-centric text flow that works across multiple resolutions. So we've covered a couple of areas. We've looked at how to use CSS3 grid and CSS3 flexible box to structure your app. And we looked at how to flow content within that structure using CSS3 regions. Now that you have an app that's both structured and flowed, one thing you may want to do is you may want to make that text look beautiful. The really cool thing about CSS3 is that it provides us with a few new cool mechanisms to do exactly that. So as we talk about multiple columns, one question I want to ask you again is, how many of you have ever created a site that has text in it? Most of us, right? How many of you would be happy to know that there's a CSS3 property that lets you take those existing sites, those existing text-centric apps, and make them beautiful at the cost of 2 properties? Probably a few people, right? Well, here's what. Act now, and at the very, very low price of 2 CSS properties, you can do exactly that. Let's look at how. Again, all of this is live on the Internet Explorer test drive site. This is CSS3 multi-column. This is another demo following a very similar pattern you've seen before. Now, what's really cool about multiple columns is that in this particular case, it may not be obvious why you would want to use it. Of course, you'll be developing apps that will be used in a variety of form factors, maybe on the slates that you all got recently, the developer preview builds. And they will have a fairly wide resolution. Some users may be looking at your apps in a landscape mode. And of course, there you have something on the order of 1,300 to 1,400 pixels to play with. Now, if you want a great reading experience in your app, historically, what you want to do is you want to target a line length of around 40 to 60 characters. Beyond that, it becomes very difficult for your eyes to track from one line down to the beginning of the next line. Now, what's really cool about CSS3 multi-column is that with a single property, you can do exactly that. So here I'll take the column count, and I'll go from 1 column to 2 columns. And with that single property, I've halved the amount of the length of each line. So you'll see in the live markup view here, all I've done is said, I want to have 2 columns. Very, very simple. Alternatively, instead of having a predefined number of columns, maybe you want to define a predefined width of columns. So if you're really targeting a scenario where you want your column width to be very precisely defined in terms of number of characters, you can do that with column width. So here we'll go and we'll say, okay, maybe I want a column of 6 EMs wide, 15 EM wide, or 21 EMs wide. Again, these are complementary technologies. You'll likely use one of the 2 properties at a time, but they provide you with a very useful mechanism to very cheaply take a fairly onerous text layout on your app and make it beautiful and very consumable for your users. Of course, once I have a couple of columns, some of you may want to expand on those ideas and improve the look and feel of your site. So here you can use the column gap property to specify the width between your columns. Or you can use the column rule width to add a rule between your columns. So here you can see that I'm adding a line. Maybe I'll make a little broader gap. I can add a nice fat line, and then I could style that rule. So I can make that dots or dashes or double lines or a ridge. And of course, I can change the color of that rule. I don't suggest that you do this very often because, again, with a lot of these tools, it's very easy to go a little overboard and go from a beautiful app to an ugly app very quickly, but the power is there for you to use. Let's reset a few of these properties. Now, one of the things you're likely to run into, again, because you're developing great metro-style apps that are going to adapt well to multiple resolutions, is in many cases you may create an app that has unbalanced columns. The text content doesn't fit precisely within the columns as we do in this example. So let's change the height of that column. Now, this is a better text experience than having a very long line of 1,400 pixels, but it's still not quite there. What's really cool about CSS3 is you can add the column fill property to balance out those lines. So you've gone from a very asymmetric, uneven design to something that looks much more legible and has a much more even distribution of text within that space. Let's go back to auto, and we'll resize again back to, let's do this. Now, this doesn't look half bad. Now, this is a text layout. It's just using a few different columns. And let's say one of the effects you want in your app is to have really crisp, clean left and right lines to each column. The first thing you're going to go off and do as a designer with CSS is you're going to use text justification to create those lines. This looks pretty good. This looks metro-y. There's clean lines on both left or right. But you can see there's also some fairly poor visual effects that are appearing. You'll see that the density of text between all those columns varies quite a bit. So if you look at that second column or maybe the third column, you'll see a very different density of text relative to that fourth column. Not a great effect. You'll also see that there's a lot of text rivers in this particular example where contiguous white lines create a fairly negative visual effect if you're creating a text-centric experience on CSS3. Now what's really cool is that in addition to multi-column, in CSS3 we've added CSS3 hyphenation. So here with a single property, I'll go back and forth. All of a sudden you go from a fairly poor text-centric experience with a lot of white space, a lot of text rivers, to compacting all of that text with hyphenation. Again, with a single CSS property. Before now, you'd have to use a lot of JavaScript libraries. There's actually a few JavaScript libraries that are out there that will introduce significant perf problems into your app, and they won't get quite the same level of hyphenation property. With CSS3, single property, and you radically improve the look and feel of your site or app. Let's go here. And of course, some of you, after you turn on hyphenation, may want to tweak that hyphenation behavior to get a really precise visual effect for your app. Of course, CSS3 hyphenation defines some properties that allow you to do that. For example, hyphenate limit cars to limit the length of words that you want evaluated for hyphenation. So here I can say I only want, for example, words that are 5 characters or longer to ever be hyphenated. And of course, if you don't want to have many lines, consecutive lines hyphenated, you can specify that with hyphenate limit lines. So here I can say I want no more than 2 consecutive lines to ever be hyphenated, or 3 consecutive lines, or maybe I just don't care and I don't want to have a limit. So if I put no limit, you'll see that there are some cases here where I have 2 or 3 lines hyphenated consecutively. And of course, just like you would have in a professional desktop publishing suite like Word, you can define a hyphenation zone to tweak that even further. So you can define an area to the right of every column where you don't want words to be hyphenated, to really get a good balance between the white space and the cognitive load on your users when they have to read hyphenated text. Lots of powerful capabilities. Now, what's really cool about hyphenation and multi-column is that they're really cheap to achieve. Let's go here. Again, with CSS3 multi-column, all you're going to do for most of you is turn on multiple columns. You'll use the column count or column width to define a number or width of columns, and your app will just immediately look much better. Some of you may want to specify the column gap for different columns to distribute them out and achieve a specific visual effect. Maybe even add a column rule and style it with a different style or color. And of course, there's a ton of power here, so you can go in as far as defining how specific elements will behave when they are positioned at the break between a column. So for example, if you have an image that arrives right at the break between the column, maybe you want to have that image flow into the next column instead of clipping, and you have a variety of properties that allow you to do that. Now with hyphenation, again, most of you will simply turn hyphenation on using the hyphens property in CSS3, and for that single property, you drastically improve the quality of your text layouts on the web platform. Some of you may want to go off and use some of these additional properties of tune hyphenation, but in most cases, I expect you not to need to do that. One of the reasons that is that using hyphenation on top of Windows 8 means that you're building on top of the hyphenation dictionaries and the hyphenation engine that shipped with many, many versions of Microsoft Office and Microsoft Word and other products in Office. What that means is for a single property, you get a ton of really high-powered value that's been proven over time. And of course, you also get the very broad range of support supported by Microsoft Office and now in Windows 8 and the web platform. So immediately you get support for 18 of the most widely used languages that use hyphenation as a linguistic construct in those languages. Really powerful stuff, and it comes at the cost of a single property for you. Now there's one more core feature that I want to cover here. This one in particular I'm really excited about. I love all of these features, but this one's really, really cool. And partly because it's so self-obvious and it's so simple, and it really enshrines some core concepts of CSS that are kind of surprising that they aren't supported today. And in fact, this particular property, it's kind of funny. I have, as I built the demo, I found myself going through different websites, experiencing the web that exists today, and every single site I went to, I saw really cool opportunities to use position floats to augment that site, augment that web app at a very, very low cost. In fact, one of the things I do on the weekends is I volunteer at the Humane Society. And one of the really cool things about that is that you'll see these sites where you'll have, basically an image of a dog or a cat and then a text blurb, and they follow a very, very similar pattern. You'll see the same pattern if you go to a game review website or maybe a book review website, where historically the web worked in very precise ways. You'll have an image, and then you'll have text. Or you'll have text, and then you'll have an image. In very rare cases, you may have an image that's float around a little text, or some text float around a little image, but it's very, very limited. And if you compare that to newspapers or magazines or other print media, you'll see that they have a much richer set of interactions between media and content that's now achievable very easily with CSS3. So let's go over here. We'll go to the position floats demo. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this talk, we talked about some of these core CSS concepts. We talked about how CSS float allows you to take an element outside of the float, position it to the left of content, and have text wrap around it. And that's precisely what we've done here. So I have an element that I've marked as a float left, and then I have a set of text in a multi-column element. Now, what CSS float does historically is it combines two disparate concepts. It combines the concept of position. So you can see as I make this element float left, it actually positions itself to the left. And it also combines that concept with this idea of flow. So in this case, you'll have the text float around that image, that div. Now, as I move that float into the multiple column elements, you'll see that both of those concepts are pretty closely entwined. So as I move that float down into the multi-column element, you'll see that its position changes. And it depends on where it's positioned in the content. Now, that means two things. As a CSS developer, if you want to achieve a very specific effect, you're going to have to tweak where that float appears inside your markup. And that's not really what you want to be able to do in CSS. It also means that it's very difficult to achieve specific effects. So you'll see a lot of this in the web today. You'll see an image in the top left, a column of text, and then you'll have the text wrap around it. One of the things you don't see very often is having an image or a text blocks appear at the bottom right of an element. And that's because it's very difficult to achieve. It's not simply as easy as putting your float at the bottom of your text flow and having it float to the right. So it's very difficult to achieve some effects as a developer you may want, that you may expect from the web platform before today. With position floats, what we've done is we've separated out those two concepts. We've separated the concept of position from the concept of wrapping. So here we can define an element using the -ms-position property, and all that does is tell the browser to treat that element as a float. It tells us to wrap text around that element, but it doesn't impact the position of the float. Of course, now when we separate out the concept of wrap from position, we can use other positioning properties to position that float. So here I've used CSS3 grid, and of course I can position that element within the text. I can wrap the content across multiple columns, and it's really easy to do. All within some declarative markup without changing any of my markup, without changing or adding any JavaScript. Really simple, really powerful to do, and a very nice, simple extension to the core concepts of CSS that fit well within the philosophy of CSS. Now you'll notice that here I haven't referred to this as CSS3 position floats. This is a very new standard. It's being standardized, and there's some great guys at Adobe who are standardizing this feature now, and it may end up being called something relatively different. They may end up calling it exclusions rather than position floats. So just sort of forewarning that you may see different words applied, but the core concept remains the same, and they're all vendor prefixed right now. So as we look at position floats, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to use in combination with things like multiple columns and hyphenation and some of the other capabilities you heard about this morning if you went to Ted Johnson's session to create very rich text flows that integrate media as well as great text. You'll use it to, again, position images, but because that div could be either an image or other arbitrary HTML content, you could also imagine it being used to create text insets into your content, or to just simply flow content around a region that you want to remain blank for some reason. And it's going to be used primarily to create very rich media with complex and adaptable text layouts. One thing I didn't show in this particular demo is that, of course, you want to have a way to opt elements out of wrapping around that content, and you could do that with the -ms-flow wrap property. Again, simply declarative with no JavaScript or HTML change. So I want to use the remainder of time. We've covered a lot of disparate concepts here. We've looked at how you can structure your app, and we saw a few properties to do that. We looked at how you could flow content within that structure, and there's a fair bit of detail there. And then we looked at how you could make your app beautiful in combination with that structure and that flow. So let's look at how they all come together. So we'll take another look at that magazine app for a second. I'll go here. And I mentioned that one of the first things, as a Metro-style developer, what you're going to do is you're going to start by deciding how you want to lay out your page, how you want to lay out your app along some type of holistic layout model. Here, I want to create a magazine that partitions my space both vertically and horizontally. So I'm going to use CSS Grid to define a grid that will lay the baseline for my app, allow me to align content. And right here, I've used a fairly simple grid. I've used a 9x9 grid with a few margins, but it will suffice for this example. Once I've defined the grid I want to use, I'll want to figure out how I want to position content within my Metro-style app. So let's do that. So in this particular magazine, what I'm going to do is I'm going to position my content to have a banner on the first page and then 3 columns of text. Possibly on the second page, I'll have 3 columns of text with an image that integrates very cleanly within that text. After I've created the structure of my app, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to want to flow the content through my app. So here I've used CSS3 regions to place regions and place my flow through that structure that I've defined with CSS3 grid. Now, it's starting to look like something that I may actually want to consume. Maybe I'll want to read that, but it's still very, very plain. So let's add some images. Here I've added a simple image that's aligned with the CSS3 grid. And if I look at the second page, what I'll do is I'll add a position float. Well, that looks somewhat better, arguably. Now I have rich media integrated with my text content. You can imagine this could be a video or possibly text inset. Here it's just an image. But there are some pretty glaring text effects in this app. You'll notice that the columns aren't crisply aligned with the grid. And also there's a big white space there because of a large word and a relatively small column and that position float. What's really cool, as I mentioned, is that with a single property, I can make all of those problems go away simply by turning on hyphenation. And then I could clean up the lines of my app using justification. And all of a sudden, with the combination of grid and regions and, of course, position floats, I've gone from an app that's, it's okay, but not really there, to something that looks like it could legitimately be a Metro-style app. Of course, you can have multiple pages, and if I snap this, all of that would flow very cleanly for multiple resolutions. So we already did that. So to reiterate a couple of points, the way you're going to be using some of these core capabilities that have been added to CSS3 to develop really elegant and clean Metro-style apps, you're going to start with CSS3 Grid and CSS3 Flexbox. You're going to be using Grid if you want to have very complex layouts that partition space vertically and horizontally, and CSS3 Flexbox maybe for smaller portions of your app or for relatively simple app layouts. You'll be using CSS3 regions to flow content in many cases through that structure that you've just defined with either CSS3 Grid or CSS3 Flexbox. And lastly, you'll use a combination of position floats, CSS3 multi-column, and CSS3 hyphenation to make that structured and flowed content look beautiful and make a great Metro-style app. So we're at the sort of the tail end of I guess, the third day of build now. So a lot of these talks have already happened. If you've sampled a little of the web platform in this talk, if you went to Ted's talk earlier today, you sample a little bit more about what CSS3 has to offer. And I recommend that if you're interested in learning more, there's a variety of different talks you should attend. There's still a couple of talks left, so if you really want to dig in more into the web app platform, I suggest that you go to Israel Hilario's talk today at, I think, 4 p.m. And Jason Weber has a great talk tomorrow that he's given a few times at different conferences that really hones in on how to create high-performance Metro-style apps on top of the web platform, and that talk should be really good. And of course, there's a bunch of links. You can look at this PowerPoint afterwards. One link I want to call out again is the Internet Explorer Test Drive site at ietestdrive.com. On that site, all of these demos are live. All of the demos that Ted showed are live, and all the demos you'll see in the other presentations from the Internet Explorer team are live. So on your Windows 8 machine, you can go to that site right now and play with all the demos and look at the markup and even maybe copy that markup into your app if you want to integrate it directly. So thank you for coming to this talk and to build. And of course, thank you in advance for building those Metro-style apps. I'm sure you're all going to leave here today and go off and build. I'll stick around for a few minutes, and of course, if you don't get around to asking me a question that comes to you after this, after we wrap up, please go to the forums and submit your feedback there. This is the start of a really long and fun journey, so all of your feedback is really welcome. Thank you.